Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us, and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Our scripture reading today is from 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 6 through 16. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. "They have credited David with tens of thousands," he thought, "but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom?" And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. May the Lord bless the reading and the hearing of his word.
I want to just say a quick word of thanks also before I begin to Pastor Glenn Howell and Pastor Matt Scholl, who preached for me while I was gone on vacation the last 2 weeks. It was wonderful to have that break and that time with my family, but it was also, I was blessed by both sermons and the opportunity to listen to them. It just reminded me of the legacy of great preaching that you guys have had here at Zionsville that I get to be part of. And so thank you to those who've gone before and preached the last 2 weeks. At the beginning of the year, I preached a series about spiritual practices. And one of the practices that I lifted up in that series was leadership, which we don't often think of as a spiritual practice. Like normally we kind of divorce it from our spirituality. Like here's my faith and everything I do over here, and it's separate from this arena in which I am leading and exercising my gifts. But the argument I made back in January was that these two things are intimately connected with one another. That God gives us the gift of leaders. And God gives leaders not just to make decisions, but God gives us leaders in order to move and rally people, to address problems, to make change in the world. Like a leader's job is to move people from here to there. And where you have good leadership, communities flourish. Resources abound, everyone's gifts get multiplied. And so that everyone has this sense of contributing to the whole and everyone shares in the benefit. That's the mark of great leadership. And unfortunately, though, and for every great leader I can name, you can probably think of a lot more bad leaders that exist in the world, places where leadership has gone wrong. I think that's the reason that there are TV shows and movies that are insanely popular, like Horrible Bosses or HBO's Succession. And I want to be clear, I'm not endorsing these shows as a pastor at all. Don't go home and watch them. I'm just saying these are extreme examples of an experience that every single one of us has had in life, that we've all experienced at some point in our journey, bad leadership. And the Bible is no different. The Bible lifts up, for every great leader you have of Israel, there are plenty of bad examples of leadership to go along. They have their own kind of hall of shame. Leaders who are poster children for ineptitude and disaster. And so I had this idea really about a year ago, I first had this idea. Wouldn't it be fun to preach a sermon about all the bad leaders of the Bible? To kind of look at them and kind of as a way of holding up a mirror and maybe reflecting on our own leadership and avoiding some of the pitfalls that they kind of represent and fell into. But I had a couple of concerns before preaching this series, Bad Leaders of the Bible. My first concern is it's all too easy to just label someone as a bad leader, right? Because I think in some ways it makes us feel good about our own leadership. Like we're much better at spotting the speck in someone else's eye than the log in our own. So it's all too easy to label others as bad and miss kind of where we've gone wrong too. And I was especially concerned when I thought, what I don't want to happen is for us to suddenly make parallels from these Israelite kings to the leaders of today, to start casting stones at all the people who are trying to lead our country today. Because I think, again, that's all too easy to do. So I didn't want to just load you up with ammunition about all the ways you can critique and criticize the leaders of our country. That's not my intent and purpose. And the more I thought about it, I realized I didn't frame it that way as bad leaders in the Bible, because the reality is that all leaders are some mixture of good and bad. Same way every single one of us is a mixture of good and bad, right? What leadership does is it puts a magnifying glass on the leader so that their gifts are multiplied and expanded, but also their faults as well. I mean, when you're in leadership, everyone can see the mistakes you make and the faults you make, and sometimes the faults in your character, the mistakes you make, they can have ripple effects, consequences that you couldn't even foresee, that you would never have intended. It's a magnifying glass effect. In other words, leadership is a place where our sin and brokenness show up. That's just a given. But that also means that leadership is a place where we can learn to seek the grace and provision of God. And that's what makes leadership a spiritual practice. So the more I thought about it, the more I decided to refine the series, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to spend the next month looking at the rise and fall of early Israel. We're going to look at the narrow slice of its history, 130 years, when Israel was a unified kingdom. And each week we're going to study and review one of the 4 kings who ruled over unified Israel: Saul, David, Solomon, Rehoboam. And you can already get that, when I name those names, those were not bad kings across the board, especially David and Solomon. They're known as those are the golden, the glory days, the golden age of Israel, where Israel expanded, to its furthest point. And yes, I'm going to acknowledge, the greatness of these kings. They weren't bad leaders necessarily. And yet we're going to spend some time each week kind of looking not just at their accomplishments, but also looking at their blind spots. What were the fatal errors that eventually led the nation of Israel to collapse and divide? And we do this with humility. Again, it's not about, piling on to their faults or even to our own. Rather, we kind of are doing this in order to claim the truth that God shows up even in the midst of our mistakes and our failures. And leadership isn't about kind of pursuing a false redemption for ourselves, but rather it's about seeking the wholeness and the healing that comes through the gospel, and then leading others along with us in that journey. So let's dig in. Let's go ahead and dig in. We're going to start with Saul, who was the first king of Israel. He reigned for about 20 years, from 1020 to 1000 BC. And before Saul, Israel it existed for about 3 centuries as a collection of tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And God would occasionally raise up leaders among the tribes. Whenever there was a foreign threat, whenever they needed a leader, often it was a military leader, and they called them a judge. Not to be confused with the judges we have who are, legal system. A judge was a leader, often a military leader. But the judge would accomplish a purpose for a set season of time, and often the mission was accomplished. After the mission was accomplished and the people were defended, the judge would recede back into history, They didn't establish a dynasty. They didn't pass down rulership from themselves to another. Instead, the king of Israel was understood to be Yahweh, to be God. And you would think, what better king could you have than God? But Israel, they wanted a king that they could see and touch. They wanted to be like the other nations around them, that they saw their kings leading them forth into battle. And so they petitioned again and again for centuries, crying out to God, give us a king, give us a king. And finally, God relented. He said, okay, you want a king? I'll give you a king. And the first king that God chose was a man named Saul. No, God appointed Saul. He told his prophet Samuel, I'm going to point out Saul to you, that the two of them met in a chance meeting. And Saul was kind of hard to miss. The Bible says that he stood head and shoulders above all of his peers. I mean, he was big and strong. He looked like a king. But to his credit, Saul was actually quite humble. When Samuel approached him and says, you're the man, Saul responded and says, whoa, you got the wrong guy. I'm a Benjamite. I'm from the smallest tribe of Israel. And my family is among the humblest of families in this tribe. Like, I'm not a king. I'm not the right stuff. But Samuel said, yeah, you are. God's chosen you. And so then Samuel anointed Saul as king. And then shortly thereafter, he hosted a meeting with all the leaders of Israel. They chose lots, and again, Saul's lot came up. He is the king. And even then, there was still some doubt about, is this the right king? Is this the right guy? And then in the next chapter, the Ammonites attack Israel, and Saul has this moment where he rallies the people to himself, and he drives out the enemy, liberates a city. And so then everyone is convinced, this is the guy, this is the king, and they gather at Gilgal, kind of their holy place, and they all celebrate, and there they make sacrifices to celebrate Saul's kingship. He is firmly established as the first king in Israel's history. But no sooner is Saul established, confirmed as king, than he begins to face his first crisis. And the crisis comes from the Philistines who are invading. He sends his son, Jonathan, to go meet them. There's a short skirmish on the border, and Jonathan doesn't lose, but what he does do is he enrages the Philistines, and the Philistines come after him en masse. So Saul rallies all the 12 tribes of Israel, all of their troops. They're there at Gilgal, ready to fight. And here come the Philistines. And I just want to read this to you. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, soldiers as numerous as the sands on the seashore. It's a pretty big army they're going up against. And when the men of Israel saw their situation was critical and that the army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks, in pits and cisterns. They were scared out of their mind, right? So Saul stayed at Gilgal with all the troops around him, and he waited for a week, because that was the time Samuel said, in a week I'm going to come to you, and then I'm going to perform a burnt offering, seek the Lord's favor, and you will have victory in battle. But he waited 7 days, and the time came and went, and Samuel did not show. And Saul begins to be afraid, because the Israelites who are with him, they don't want to go into this battle. And when Samuel doesn't show, they begin to waver in their commitment. Many of them begin returning back to their home. And seeing his forces, his army slip away, Saul says, okay, I will do the offering. And he does the offering in front of everyone to seek the Lord's favor. Now, just at that moment, who would arrive except Samuel? And perhaps if I was over a week late to the battle, maybe I would come in saying, apologetic, like, I'm so sorry I'm late. Thanks for taking care of this in my absence. But that's not what Samuel does at all. Instead, he confronts Saul and says, what have you done? Why have you performed this offering? Why weren't you patient? Why didn't you trust in me? Instead, he says, you have done foolishly. For you have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord instead has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has appointed him, not you, to be ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Now here's the funny part, is that after this confrontation with Samuel, Saul still has to go fight the Philistines, who, remember, number more numerous than the sands of the seashore. And guess what? He wins. He wins the battle. God gives him favor and the Israelites favor. And so I'm sure Saul is thinking, whew, I thought God was against me, but maybe not. Maybe Samuel just had to blow off some steam. And maybe I'm good after all. But then the pattern repeated itself in chapter 14. And the pattern repeated itself again in chapter 15. God continues to give Saul victory after victory after victory in battle. And Saul continues after victory after victory after victory to disobey, disobey, disobey. The final straw comes in chapter 15 when God commands Saul, after you take the city, kill all the livestock in the city, wipe them out. And instead of killing all the livestock, Saul chooses the best ones, the prettiest ones, the fattest ones, and keeps them for himself. And Samuel comes to him and says again, this is the last straw. You have disobeyed the explicit command of your God. Saul says, well, I was going to offer him, I was going to make a big festival, make a big celebration with the people of Israel. And Samuel says, God doesn't want your sacrifice. He wants your obedience. But because you have rejected the word of the Lord has rejected you as king. And then at the very end of the chapter comes this harsh, damning sentence. I mean, one of the most harsh judgments of the Bible, I think. It says, the Lord was sorry that he made Saul king of Israel. Can you imagine if that sentence was said about you? The Lord was sorry he made Saul king. And so in the next chapter, God sets in motion his new plan for the king of Israel. He sends Samuel to the small town of Bethlehem, to a man named Jesse. And there he interviews all 7 of Jesse's sons, and instead of choosing the biggest and strongest, he chooses the runt of the litter, the smallest shepherd boy named David. He is the anti-Saul in terms of look and appearance, but he has the right heart. And so Samuel anoints him on the spot. And then shortly thereafter, he is called by Saul to the royal palace because David is a gifted musician and music helps calm Saul down whenever he's in distress. And so very quickly, David is ushered into the realms of power. And then the very next chapter, chapter 17, is when he has his infamous showdown with Goliath. And no sooner does he kill Goliath, and suddenly David is an instant celebrity. All the people are singing his praise. And what does that do to his relationship with Saul? It poisons it. Saul is instantly threatened by David to the point where David is not safe in Saul's household anymore. In fact, on 2 separate occasions, when Saul is in distress and David tries to calm him down with music, Saul takes a spear and tries to throw it at David, tries to kill him. And these attempts on David's life escalate and escalate and escalate until finally David reaches the conclusion, I can't stay here anymore. He flees out into the desert, warned by Saul's son Jonathan, my dad's going to kill you. You got to get out of here. And when David escapes Saul, Saul is so mad, so enraged that he slaughters the priests who helped David escape. And that plunges the nation into civil war. From then on, it's Team David and Team Saul. And David, for the most part, is on the run. He outfoxes Saul every step of the way. But Saul keeps hunting and pursuing. And the thing about David that's so amazing in all this is his heart doesn't turn against Saul. He still recognizes that he's the Lord's anointed. He's the king. I'm next in line, but he knows I'm not going to take Saul out. In fact, on 2 separate occasions, David had the opportunity to kill Saul. Both times he spared his life. And he made a big show out of saying, of trying to demonstrate to Saul, your life is safe in my hands. But even though he went out of his way to show that he was not a threat, Saul continued to see him as a threat, continued to press the battle, continued to pursue after him, until finally, at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 31, Saul is killed. Not by David, but by the Philistines. Remember them way back at the beginning? The threat that Saul forgot because he was so focused on David, that was what got him in the end. So that's Saul's story. And let me, as we reflect back on it, let me ask you this question. Where did it go wrong? I mean, it began with such promise. He looked like a king. He had the right heart. He was humble. He won his first battle. Like, where did it begin to go wrong? What was the fault in his character that led to his downfall? Well, the Bible phrases it in terms of rebellion and disobedience, that he rejected the command of the Lord. But let me suggest to you maybe a deeper issue underneath that I think the issue for Saul was insecurity. He was insecure in his leadership. Go back to that first time when he did the burnt offering in Samuel's place. What was happening in that moment? There was a huge army facing him, and all the people were afraid. But more than that, it was that his army was leaving. He was losing their support. He was losing their favor. And so what did he do? He performed the offering to make himself the center, to rally the people around him again. It was insecurity that drove that decision. Go even to the point where where he didn't kill all the animals. He kept the best for himself. When he was confronted by Samuel about it, how did he respond? Well, he confessed. He said, he confessed, and I've sinned, transgressed the command of the Lord. But listen to what he does then. He says, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice instead of God's. First off, what kind of leader does that? He threw all the people under the bus. Like, well, it wasn't me, it was the people who told me to do it. But secondly, just in that sense, I feared the people. Even then, he wasn't the kind of leader who could stand up to public pressure. And then David comes on the scene, and that insecurity finds its full expression. I mean, you gotta feel sorry for the guy. I mean, David fights one battle, kills one giant, which is great, but suddenly people are singing songs. Saul has fought off the Ammonites, the Amalekites, the Philistines, and yet people are singing, Saul's slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Of course he's jealous. Of course he feels threatened. But he allows that insecurity to become a fixation. He becomes unhealthy, unhinged, and ultimately this insecurity leads to his doom because it takes his eyes off the real threat, the Philistines. He completely forgot about him. He was so worried about David. Have you ever worked with an insecure leader? Have you ever been in a relationship with someone who is driven by insecurity? Or have you ever felt insecure yourself? Let me make a few observations about insecure leaders. The first thing is the insecure leaders, they are stuck in a defensive stance because they see everything and everyone as a potential threat. Insecure leaders don't move you forward boldly in new directions. Why? They can't do that. They're too afraid. Instead, they hunker down and they defend and they protect. Rather than building bridges of understanding and cooperation, they build walls of mistrust and suspicion. If you're working with an insecure leader, you're not going anywhere. You're stuck. Secondly, insecure leaders, they minimize, they diminish the impact and gifts of all those around them, because the thing about insecure leaders, their star has to shine the brightest. And so everyone else has to dim their potential, dim their contributions down so as not to threaten that insecure leader. And lastly, an insecure leader, by making it about themselves, they miss the larger goal. Because it's about them, right? It's about their success, their reputation, their image, not the success of the organization, not the well-being of everyone else around them. And here's the great irony. By making it about themselves, an insecure leader sabotages the very thing that they seek to protect, which is their legacy. Now, Saul, his insecurity, his anxiety is prompted by a very singular question. The question of succession. And succession is a big, scary word. I mean, it's a big enough idea to make any of us feel a little anxious, right? To think about taking something we love, something we've invested our lives in building and protecting, whether it's a business, a church, a family, a farm, whatever it is that you have invested your life and your leadership in, to think about handing that off to someone else, your baby. I mean, it does make you feel like, ask questions like, are they ready for this? Do they know what to do? Will they give themselves to this in the same way that I always have? Will they go in the same direction, or will they take it in different directions that I resisted, that I didn't want us to go? Will they make the same mistakes that I've made along the way? But those weren't the questions Saul was asking, to be honest. He wasn't really concerned about the nation's well-being or success. His questions were of a much more personal nature. I think Saul was asking, what if I don't matter anymore? What if everything I've done gets forgotten? Author Wendell Berry says that at any given time, there's always two stories going on. There's our individual stories, right? The story of our life. But they're always set against the backdrop of a larger story, what he calls the story of the place, the story of Zionsville, the story of the church. And I would say it's not just about the physical place in which we live, but it's the institutions in which we live, towards which we give ourselves. That those are the larger stories that frame our lives. And Wendell Berry says that leaders who get it wrong elevate their own story. They think their story is the one that matters, and the story of the place, the story of the people around them, it exists in order to elevate, to enhance, to bring them glory, because it's all about their story. Leaders who get it right understand that the longer story, the story that really matters, is the story of the place. It was here before we got here, and it'll be here long after we're gone. And so the leaders who get it right understand that their story is about caretaking and stewarding the story of the place while they're alive, and about investing in the people who will then carry that story forward. What would it have looked like if Saul had been less threatened by David and had instead embraced him as the next leader of Israel? What would it have looked like? How different would his story have been? And while you're thinking about that, let me ask the second question. Here's where it gets a little personal. Is what would our world be like if we were a little bit less like Saul? Because I think so many of the problems we have in our world today, the gridlock we get stuck in, happens because we don't know how to think about succession, about how to handle, how to deal with our own insecurities. I mean, look in our country. When one administration moves out, what happens? No sooner has one side kind of moved out of power than they immediately begin working to sabotage and undermine the people who've been elevated into leadership so that they can regain control again. Like, this is the pattern that we get stuck in. And I know that's the way the world works. But imagine if there was a different way. A way where we are less threatened by one another and more able to work together and find common ground to work for good. And I'm not just even talking, I know I gave the example of our country, but it doesn't have to happen just on the macro level. It can happen on the micro level as well. In our church, in our schools, in our community, in our families. What would it look like if we learn to embrace one another, to embrace what is next, rather than being threatened? The truth is, every single one of us, we are building on a foundation that was set by those who came before. All of us have received a legacy of faith that has been given to us. And every single one of us, whatever it is that we're building, we're preparing the way for the generations who are going to come after. And having that mindset of knowing where we stand in the story, it sets us free. We can honor what's been before. We can contribute the best of what we have. And we can make space for the gifts and ideas and the leadership of others. And above all, we can trust in God. To know that God, in his good time and his good pleasure, will raise up his leaders to accomplish his good and perfect will. We can trust in that, and that can free us to let go. So most of this sermon has been about a negative example of succession. So let's end on a positive note. Let's think for a second about a moment when succession has gone right. And the story I want to lift up is a story from our own history. It's 4th of July, after all, right? And we talk about the peaceful transfer of power from one administration to the next. It's one of the great legacies we've received as Americans, one of the hallmarks of democracy. But we forget that this was not a given when our nation was born. This was not the tradition, the way of doing things. It had to be established and secured by the wisdom and example of our forefathers, specifically our first president, George Washington. If you feel insecure about handing something over to someone else, think about George Washington, handing over leadership of this new country that is just now getting its sea legs, so to speak. How hard that had to be. There's this moment in the musical Hamilton that captures it well, where Hamilton and Washington are arguing. Hamilton is trying to convince Washington to run for a 3rd term. As far as the people are concerned, he says, you have to serve. No one else can do this. And Washington calmly, gently, forcefully replies, and we're going to teach him how to say goodbye. Because if I say goodbye, the country gets to move on. It'll outlive me when I'm gone. And after they have this dialogue back and forth, then the song, one last time, concludes with an actual word-for-word rendition of Washington's letter to our country when he announced he wasn't running for his 3rd term. And so I'm going to play this song for you, at least this little section of it. It's an opportunity. And what I want you to do as you listen to these words is I want you to reflect on where you've been in leadership, where you are in leadership right now. I want to ask the question, what would it look like to have the same perspective as Washington did, to understand that we're part of a bigger story and we're really serving something that will outlive us when we're gone? If you're feeling insecure this morning in a relationship, in the office, or in some other place in your life, how can you give that insecurity to God and to trust him, not only to provide for you, but to provide for the places you live and serve, and in that provision to find peace? Let's hear Washington's words.
Though in reviewing the incidents of my administration, I am unconscious of intentional error, I am nevertheless too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I may have committed many errors. I shall also carry with me the hope that my country will view them with indulgence, and that after 45 years of my life dedicated to its service with an upright zeal, the faults of incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as I myself will soon be to the mansions of rest. I anticipate with pleasing expectation that retreat in which I promise myself to realize the sweet enjoyment of partaking in the midst of my fellow citizens, the benign influence of good laws and the free government, the ever-favorite object of my heart, and the happy reward, as I trust, of our mutual care, labors, and dangers.
Good morning. My name is Tracy Vermillion, and I am the Director of Children's Ministry here at Zionsville UMC. Thank you for joining us today. We would love to get to know you more and spend more time with you. If you'd like to know more about our faith community, please visit our church website at zumc.org. There, you'll find the many ministry opportunities we have to offer. If you need to contact one of our staff members, all our contact information is at the bottom of all the church web pages. You also can connect with us via social media throughout your week for daily inspiration and community. You'll find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube under username Zionsville UMC. Once again, thank you for joining us this morning, and we hope you have a wonderful week.